3 Chinese military satellites went offline last Monday. Not 2, not 4. 3 specific satellites. The Yaogan 41 reconnaissance satellite, the Shenzhen 21 space debris remediation vehicle, and one of the 2 Yaogan 36 triplet ocean surveillance satellites went offline within a 4-hour window in a sequence whose timing is not consistent with any technical failure mode that Chinese space engineers have documented or any natural event that space weather monitoring services recorded. They went silent. Their telemetry ceased. Their control signals stopped responding. And inside the People's Liberation Army, Strategic Support Forces Space Systems Department in Beijing, the command responsible for China's 260-satellite military constellation, a team of engineers who had never previously confronted a satellite anomaly they could not diagnose within 6 hours, was 72 hours after the events, still unable to produce an explanation for what happened to 3 of their most important orbital assets. You will be very surprised when you understand exactly what took those satellites offline, and why what the Pentagon activated last Monday has permanently changed every government's calculation about what war in space actually looks like. But to understand what the Pentagon just activated, you first need to understand what China believed it had built in orbit. And that story begins not with a satellite, but with a strategy. Now, I want you to picture something. Imagine you are a senior planner in the PLA Strategic Support Force. Your job, for the past decade, has been to build the space architecture that supports the most important military capability China possesses, the ability to find, track, and target American carrier strike groups in the vast expanse of the Western Pacific, where the ocean is so large and American ships move so fast that no land-based sensor network can maintain continuous coverage sufficient for the targeting solutions that China's DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles require. You have built a constellation whose specific design was driven by one operational requirement: real-time maritime surveillance of the waters between the first and second island chains, updated frequently enough that a moving carrier strike group cannot maneuver outside the targeting solution before the missile arrives. You have the Yaogan reconnaissance satellites that image specific areas of ocean at high resolution. You have the Yaogan 36 triplet clusters whose radar imaging can see through clouds and darkness. You have the Tianhui stereo mapping satellites that provide the geographic reference frames your targeting computers need. And you have the Shenzhen 21, the satellite that China describes publicly as a space debris remediation vehicle, and that American Space Command describes, in classified assessments, as a proximity operations platform whose robotic arm can grapple other satellites and whose demonstrated approach profiles are those of a rendezvous and inspection vehicle whose civilian purpose is indistinguishable from its military counterpart. You have spent 12 years and more than $47 billion building this constellation. You believe it is the foundation on which China's ability to deny American naval power projection in the Western Pacific rests. 3 of your most important nodes just went offline. But here is the most critical detail. The 3 satellites that went offline last Monday were not chosen randomly. They were not the satellites that would be most dramatic to disable. They were the 3 satellites whose simultaneous loss creates the most operationally significant gap in China's maritime surveillance coverage of the Taiwan Strait and the approaches to it, a gap whose specific geometry, when plotted against the orbital tracks of China's remaining constellation, creates a window of reduced coverage over the exact maritime corridors that American carrier strike groups would use in a Taiwan contingency. The targeting chain that China's DF-21D carriers require depends on continuous handoffs between satellites as each one passes over the horizon. Remove 3 nodes from the right places in that chain, and the chain does not degrade, it breaks. We will explain exactly what capability the Pentagon activated to do this in the later part of this video. But first, you need to understand why the space domain had become the most critical and most overlooked dimension of the Taiwan contingency. Because the answer to that question is the answer to why Monday's events matter more than any conventional military development in the Pacific in the past 5 years. Because China's military power in the Western Pacific is not in its missiles. The missiles are the delivery system, the targeting data is the weapon, and the targeting data lives in space. The figures behind China's military space program are the first thing you must understand. Because those numbers describe not a space exploration ambition or a civilian technology program, but the most consequential military build-out in the orbital environment since the Cold War arms race put American and Soviet reconnaissance satellites above every corner of the Earth. China operated 260 military satellites as of January 2026, more than any country except the United States, and growing at a rate of approximately 40 new military satellites per year. Of those 260, the PLA Strategic Support Forces Targeting and Reconnaissance Constellation includes 34 Yaogan series satellites in various orbital configurations, providing coverage of every point on Earth at average revisit intervals of between 90 minutes and 6 hours depending on location. For the waters between the first and second island chains, the specific maritime environment where American carrier strike groups would operate in a Taiwan contingency, the constellation was providing revisit intervals of approximately 40 minutes as of its most recently confirmed configuration. 40 minutes. Every 40 minutes, China's maritime surveillance constellation could update its picture of the Western Pacific with sufficient resolution to track moving carrier strike groups, update their position, speed, and heading, and feed that data into the targeting computers that generate firing solutions for the DF-21D. A carrier strike group traveling at 30 knots covers 20 nautical miles in 40 minutes. The DF-21D's terminal maneuvering warhead can adjust its trajectory to cover 20 nautical miles of target motion. The 40-minute revisit interval was, before Monday, sufficient. The targeting chain was closed. The 3 satellites that went offline on Monday have opened that chain. The specific orbital geometry of the loss, combined with the known parameters of China's remaining constellation, has extended the coverage gap over the Taiwan Strait approaches from 40 minutes to approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes in certain sectors. A carrier strike group covering 130 nautical miles in that window is outside the DF-21D's terminal adjustment range. China's carrier killer missile is still in its silo, but it can no longer find its target in the window that matters. Now I will show you an image. This image shows a reality that China's state media will never show you. It is a diagram of the orbital coverage pattern for China's maritime surveillance constellation, before and after Monday's events. Before, a web of overlapping orbital tracks, whose combined coverage over the Taiwan Strait is essentially continuous, with the 40-minute gaps that the constellation's designers built in as an acceptable tactical limitation. After, a web with 3 gaps whose specific positions create a 4-hour and 20-minute window of degraded coverage, whose geometry is not random. It is shaped exactly like the corridor that American carrier strike groups would use to approach the Taiwan Strait from the south and east. The corridor is now open, not permanently, not irreversibly, but open at this moment, during this window, in exactly the way that matters for a contingency that has been building for 3 years. This is where things get really strange, because the capability that the Pentagon activated last Monday has been in development since the year that China launched its first Yaogan satellite in 2006, not in response to China's space build-out. In parallel with it, a research program hidden inside the black budget of the National Reconnaissance Office, funded as a classified line item in a budget whose public description was the study of orbital environment characterization, and whose actual purpose was something categorically different: the development of a capability to influence the electromagnetic operating environment of specific satellites in specific orbits without physical contact, without debris generation, and without the kind of observable signature that would constitute a recognized act of war under the international legal frameworks that govern space operations. The capability exists. Monday was the first time it was used outside a test environment. This detail changes everything. Now let's address the question that every space power's military command, every satellite operator, and every government whose military doctrine depends on space-based assets is working through right now. What exactly did the Pentagon activate? But before we describe the capability in terms that are publicly available, we need to understand something about the specific legal and strategic framework within which the United States has been developing counterspace capabilities, because the framework explains both why the capability was developed the way it was, and why its activation last Monday carries implications that go far beyond the 3 satellites that went offline. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit, and the militarization of the moon and other celestial bodies. It does not prohibit the placement of conventional weapons in orbit, the development of ground-based anti-satellite systems, or the use of electronic warfare against satellites operating in the electromagnetic environment that space-based systems depend on. The specific legal gap between what the Outer Space Treaty prohibits and what it permits is the space that American counterspace technology development has been working in for 2 decades, not to circumvent international law, to operate within it while developing capabilities that achieve military objectives without the acts of physical destruction that both the law and American strategic preferences counsel against. Destroying a satellite with a kinetic kill vehicle creates debris. Debris in low Earth orbit travels at 2,500 miles per hour and endangers every other satellite in the same orbital shell, including American satellites, commercial satellites, and the International Space Station. The calculus against kinetic ASAT weapons is not primarily legal, it is practical. A kinetic ASAT weapon that destroys a Chinese reconnaissance satellite also creates a debris field that threatens the American GPS constellation, the American military communications satellites, and the commercial Earth observation infrastructure that both military planning and global commerce depend on. The capability that the Pentagon activated last Monday does not create debris. It does not physically contact the target satellite. It operates in the electromagnetic domain. the radio frequencies, the power systems, the attitude control mechanisms, the data processing hardware, in ways that cause the satellite to fail without leaving a debris signature and without producing the kind of incontrovertible evidence of hostile action that would require the targeted country to respond publicly. 3 satellites went offline. The Chinese Space Authority issued a statement describing anomalous technical conditions requiring investigation. No accusation was made, no response was demanded. The satellites are offline. The coverage gap exists, and the absence of a debris field means the absence of proof. Let that sink in for a moment. The most significant counterspace operation in history has occurred, and the country whose satellites were targeted cannot publicly acknowledge that its satellites were targeted, because doing so would require admitting that its most critical military space assets were defeated by a capability it cannot fully characterize, cannot currently counter, and cannot reveal knowledge of without revealing the extent of the operational impact. China's silence is the most eloquent confirmation that something significant happened last Monday. Now let's look at what Monday's activation means for the countries whose security calculations depend most directly on the space domain. Because the degradation of China's maritime surveillance constellation does not only change the Taiwan Strait's military balance, it changes the way every space-dependent military on Earth thinks about the vulnerability of its most critical assets. Let's start with Taiwan. Taipei's military planners have spent 3 years building a defense doctrine around the specific threat that China's satellite constellation poses, a doctrine whose requirements for dispersal, deception, mobility, and electronic silence were all driven by the knowledge that Chinese satellites were watching with a revisit interval that made fixed positions essentially transparent. The sudden opening of a 4-hour and 20-minute coverage gap in the specific maritime corridors where Taiwan's naval assets would need to operate in a contingency does not change Taiwan's doctrine. It changes its prospects. Taiwan's F-16V fighters, whose air-to-surface missions against Chinese amphibious forces would require operating in the windows when Chinese targeting satellites are not overhead, now have a window that is more than 6 times larger than the one they were planning around. The tactical opportunity this creates is not theoretical. Taiwan's defense planners are quantifying it right now in classified planning sessions that they are conducting with far more optimism than they were conducting last week. Now let's look at Japan. Tokyo's response to Monday's satellite events has been the most institutionally significant of any American allies, because Japan is the country that has most directly integrated American space-based intelligence into its own military planning, and that has the most sophisticated domestic understanding of the relationship between China's satellite constellation and the threat China's anti-ship missiles pose to Japanese territory and Japanese security guarantees. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency and the Japan Defense Intelligence Headquarters held a joint emergency analysis session within 36 hours of Monday's events, a session whose existence was not publicly announced, but whose occurrence has been confirmed by Japanese Defense Ministry sources. Japan's analysts produced an assessment of the coverage gap within 12 hours of the session's conclusion. The assessment was shared with American counterparts through the classified intelligence channel that connects the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command to Japan's Self-Defense Force Intelligence Directorate. Japan's assessment of the coverage gap's implications for the Taiwan contingency was described by a source familiar with its contents as the most operationally significant intelligence product Japan has received on the China military threat in the current calendar year. Now let's look at India. New Delhi's perspective on Monday's satellite events is informed by a specific combination of interests that makes it the most complex of any major powers, because India is simultaneously a country that has been targeted by Chinese military satellites conducting surveillance of the Himalayan border regions, where the two countries have been in military confrontation since 2020, a country that has its own counterspace program whose classified dimensions were revealed in part by the 2019 Mission Shakti anti-satellite test, and a country that has chosen to maintain strategic autonomy between the American and Chinese space programs, rather than fully aligning with either. India's analysis of Monday's events focuses on a specific question that the United States would prefer India not focus on. If the capability that the Pentagon activated last Monday can be used against Chinese military satellites, it can be used against any satellite, including Indian satellites. The same electromagnetic domain techniques that degraded 3 Chinese reconnaissance satellites last Monday can be applied to any satellite operating in the orbital environment, regardless of whose flag it was launched under. India is not a Chinese ally, but India is also not an American client. And the demonstration that space-based assets are vulnerable to an undeclared, undeniable, and attribution-resistant capability in American hands is a demonstration that changes India's space security calculus in ways that New Delhi is not publicly discussing, but is privately assessing with considerable urgency. India's space security review, commissioned by the Cabinet Committee on Security in the 48 hours since Monday's events, is examining a question that no country with space assets can ignore. What specific characteristics of their own satellites' electromagnetic operating environment could make them vulnerable to the same class of capability that degraded China's Yaogan 41 on Monday? The answer to that question will determine how every space power designs its next generation of military satellites. Now let's look at the counter-argument, because there are serious analysts who argue that Monday's satellite anomalies were technical failures, and that the attribution of those failures to an American counterspace capability is speculation whose certainty exceeds the available evidence. And those arguments deserve to be examined before we explain why the totality of what is known makes the attribution not speculation, but the most parsimonious explanation of facts that no other explanation accounts for as well. The first counterargument is that satellites fail. Satellites in low Earth orbit experience radiation effects, micrometeorite impacts, electronic component degradation, and software anomalies that can cause failures whose timing is coincidental rather than caused. 3 satellites failing in 4 hours is statistically unusual but not impossible. This argument is weakened by the specific nature of what failed. Yaogan 41 is a 3-year-old satellite operating well within its designed service life. Shenzhen 21 was operational for less than 8 months and had demonstrated full functionality on its last status report. The Yaogan 36 triplet member that failed has 2 identical siblings that continue to function normally. Simultaneous failure of 3 satellites of different ages, different designs, and different orbital positions from different causes within 4 hours is not impossible, but it is the kind of coincidence that intelligence analysts are trained to question rather than accept. The second counterargument is that the United States would not risk the escalation implications of a counter-space operation against China at this moment in the Taiwan Strait's tension trajectory. This argument is weakened by the specific characteristics of the capability that was used. If the capability produces no debris, creates no explosion, generates no attribution-resistant physical evidence, and gives China no unambiguous basis for a public accusation, the escalation risk is qualitatively different from the escalation risk of a kinetic SAT attack. The United States did not blow up 3 Chinese satellites. 3 Chinese satellites went offline for reasons that Chinese engineers are still investigating. The difference between those 2 sentences is the difference between an act of war and a plausible deniability operation that the targeted country cannot publicly respond to without acknowledging its own vulnerability. Brian Whedon, a former U.S. Air Force space officer and now director of program planning at the Secure World Foundation, described the strategic logic in a public essay published 48 hours after Monday's events. He wrote, "The most strategically valuable counterspace capability is not the one that destroys the most satellites. It is the one that achieves the most operational effect at the lowest escalation risk. A capability that degrades satellite function without physical destruction, that produces no debris signature, and that creates no attribution. Certainty gives the user the military benefit of counterspace operations, while denying the target the political justification for a military response. This is the counterspace capability that every major space power has been working toward. The question after Monday is which country got there first?" Whedon was not confirming the attribution. He was describing the strategic logic that makes the attribution the most compelling explanation of Monday's events. Now let's look at Russia, because Moscow's response to Monday's satellite anomalies has been the most revealing of any government's response. Revealing not because Russia has said something significant about what happened, but because of what Russia's military space establishment did in the 48 hours after it became clear that 3 Chinese military satellites had gone offline in unusual circumstances. Russia's military space forces activated an emergency review of the electromagnetic operating environment of its own GLONASS navigation satellite constellation within 6 hours of the Chinese satellite anomalies becoming known in Russian intelligence channels. GLONASS is Russia's equivalent of the American GPS system, a constellation of 24 active satellites whose continuous operation is essential to the precision navigation of Russian military systems, from ballistic missiles to ground force operations. The review was not publicly announced. Its activation was detected through the specific pattern of communications between Russia's 15th Army of the Aerospace Forces and the GLONASS control center at Korolyov, outside Moscow, whose traffic volume increased dramatically in a way that American signals intelligence was able to observe through routine collection. Why would Russia review its own satellite constellation's electromagnetic operating environment in response to Chinese satellite failures? There's only one answer that makes sense. Russia's space military establishment has assessed that the Chinese failures were not technical. They were caused, and Russia knows its own constellation is operating in the same electromagnetic environment. Russia is checking whether it is next. That assessment, implicit in the emergency review that Russia launched within 6 hours of the Chinese anomalies, is the most significant confirmation available that Monday's events were not a coincidence. Let's go back to the beginning. At the start of this video, I described a senior planner in the PLA Strategic Support Force who had spent 12 years and $47 billion building the satellite constellation that underpins China's ability to target American carrier strike groups in the Western Pacific. A constellation whose 34 Yaogan reconnaissance satellites and radar imaging triplets provided revisit intervals sufficient to keep the DF-21D's targeting chain closed against a moving carrier strike group. A man who believed, when he reviewed the constellation's operational status on Sunday, that China's space-based targeting infrastructure was functioning as designed. That man reviewed his constellation's status on Tuesday. 3 nodes were offline. The coverage gap over the Taiwan Strait approaches was 4 hours and 20 minutes. The targeting chain that he had spent 12 years closing was open in the sector that matters most. Chinese officials can appear on state television and describe their space program as proceeding normally, describe the satellite anomalies as technical conditions under investigation, describe American counter-space capabilities as provocations that will be met with a firm response at the appropriate time. They can point to the 257 satellites still operating normally, to the domestic development of satellite replacement capability, to the international legal frameworks that they argue prohibit exactly what appears to have happened. But at the end of the day, when those officials sit in the closed meetings where the Strategic Support Force is presenting its honest operational assessment, this is the picture they will see. 3 nodes offline, a 4-hour and 20-minute coverage gap, a targeting chain that was designed to be unbreakable, broken, and no ability to publicly accuse the country that broke it, because the accusation would require admitting the operational impact. And the operational impact is the one thing that China's military deterrence doctrine requires the adversary not to know. Xi Jinping set out to build a military space program so capable, so extensive, so comprehensively designed to support China's conventional military deterrence in the Pacific, that no American military operation in the waters near Taiwan could occur without being continuously tracked, targeted, and subject to the precision anti-ship fires that China's maritime surveillance constellation was built to enable. He built 260 satellites. He built the DF-21D. He built the targeting chain. He built, over 12 years and $47 billion, the architecture of maritime denial that was supposed to make American carrier strike groups irrelevant in the Western Pacific without firing a single shot, by making them visible, targeted, and destroyed before they could contest what China chose to do in the Strait. He did not build the architecture, knowing that the electromagnetic operating environment it depends on could be silently, untraceably, deniably degraded by a capability that America spent 17 years developing and activated for the first time last Monday. The satellites are offline, the chain is broken, the corridor is open, and in a facility whose address is classified and whose existence is not publicly acknowledged, the team that activated the capability last Monday is watching the same orbital coverage diagrams that the PLA's Space Operations Center is watching, and seeing the same gap. They put it there. Thank you for watching. Please like the video and leave a comment below so that this geopolitical analysis reaches more people. Here at this channel, we will continue to follow every development as the space domain enters the most consequential chapter in its military history.